Please welcome our guest, Roland Warren.
So, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Paul, for reaching out to me. I've been a fan for New Canaan Society for many years, and have had a couple opportunities to share at different chapters in the past. So it's a great opportunity for me. So Paul had reached out to me, and we had a good conversation. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is just kind of what's going on in terms of our country and the racial conflict and that we're seeing. And as I was thinking about this whole situation, I thought back to something that happened to me several decades ago now. I remember the first time that I was called that racial slur that we don't say in our culture very much anymore. And I remember I was a 15-year-old kid. I was out one evening. We had lived in the north and we moved to the south, and heard this car coming towards me. It was just about dusk, and then I started hearing this music and hearing all this laughing, and then I looked up, and somebody threw something at me, and I kind of held my breath. I didn't know what it was, and then it hit me, and it was an egg, and then they yelled that word, and then they drove off laughing. And I still remember that moment. I mean, it's probably a bunch of teenage boys, doing what kids can do from now and then. And sometimes, a word is not just a word. An egg is not just an egg. And, just the anger in me at that moment, vulnerability, just feeling dehumanized, feeling like an object, was pretty evident. And so I certainly, on my end, can kind of relate to a lot of the passion out there, the George Floyd situation, that kind of thing, and kind of being in that moment and feeling pretty powerless. But, at that time, I had to think about, like, how was I going to respond to that? And I almost knew instinctively that how I viewed that or thought about that would shape how I thought about people, how I thought about white people, how I thought about black people, how I thought about these kinds of issues. And, what do I do with all that? And how do I let that shape me? And in what direction do I let it take me? And so that was something that really kind of formed kind of my thinking around these issues. And I'll kind of get into more of that now, but so I'll just kind of put that out there, that was really sort of my viewpoint. How am I going to let this situation shape me as I go forward? So you kind of fast forward to the climate we're in now, and it was interesting because when you look on internet, Facebook, Twitter, the regular media, there's all this discussion about whose side are you on? Are you for Black Lives Matter? Are you for All Lives Matter? Are you for Trump? Are you for Biden? Are you for Republicans or Democrats, liberals or conservatives? There's all this this perspective of whose side are you on as you kind of think about this issue. And there's a lot of conflict connected to that, friendships that are being frayed because of that perspective. And so I started praying to God, like, how should I be thinking about this in this climate? And I was reading through Joshua. And I came across Joshua chapter 5, verse 13 through 15. And it's an interesting passage because, Moses has moved off the scene. Joshua is now ready to kind of help the Israelites move into the promised land. And he's there by himself, and a man appears before him. What looks like a man appears before him, and he has a sword on his side. And so Joshua, knowing he's going into battle, he asks this question. He says, well, are you for us or for our adversary? Are you for us or for our adversary? And the man says, no, which is an odd response to that question. And as I started to think about that and meditate on that, this is a pretty significant and relevant passage to where we are today. You see, because that man, if you look up the Hebrew term for that man at that time, it was actually sort of a human form, but not necessarily a man. It was actually the pre-incarnate Christ. And so Joshua asks him this question. He says, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord, and now I've come. And what struck me was that the question that Joshua was asking of him was actually the question that Joshua should be asking of himself. are you for him or are you for his adversary? And we know who the adversary of Christ is, right? It's the evil one. So it's not whether someone's on your side or not on your side. The question before us is, are you on God's side? Are you on God's side in terms of the way you're thinking about this issue? Are you on God's side? As folks draw their battle lines and different, are you on God's side? That's the real question for me. And are you letting your perspective about this issue be shaped by CNN, NBC, Fox News, Twitter, Facebook, or any of those things, or are you on God's side? That's the question that God challenged me with. And so then the next aspect of that really comes back to, well, what does it mean to be on God's side? I mean, what does it mean to be on God's side? So you look through Scripture, a key attribute of God is justice, this notion of justice. Right? That our God is a just God. He wants us to seek justice. And so if you're going to be on God's side, you have to be for justice. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that you're protecting the vulnerable. That means that you are making sure that justice happens in every single setting and that you're actually seeking it. My wife and I were in an airport a long time ago now, and we were standing in line waiting for the TSA check through, and a TSA officer comes with a dog, and the dog starts coming through and starts sniffing everyone and passes us by and comes to this one guy with a backpack and then just starts to go crazy. And then his handler gives him a treat, and they go back, and I realized in that moment, well, this was really just a training exercise. But God gave me an insight in that moment that, that dog was focused on finding whatever smelled like a bomb or whatever they had trained him to find. And it struck me that if you're seeking justice, that's the same attitude that you must have, that we must seek it that way. And when we find it, we must celebrate it and encourage others to find it. In other words, we're sniffing out injustice, not passive about it, but active about that in terms of that. So as you kind of think about this issue, when you have that perspective, that you're going to seek justice that way, and that you're going to be on the side of justice, not just in some situations, but in all situations. And are you going to be working against injustice? So there's one aspect there. But the second aspect of it, frankly, is the other side of this, which is mercy. Our God is a merciful God. So there are a lot of folks who say no justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. But that's actually only partially true, because if there's no mercy, there's no peace either. And so that part really kind of challenges folks, because a key aspect of mercy is forgiveness. A key aspect of mercy is forgiveness. And so if I have unforgiveness in my heart, then I'm not on God's side. And so part of my kind of question as we kind of look at this, and I hear a lot of folks say, well, we've got to make sure that we're just, and white folks need to be just, right? In terms of, some historical stuff or whatever. And I get that. But I think there's another part to this narrative, which is this whole notion of unforgiveness. And so me as a Black man, if I have unforgiveness in my heart, then I'm not on God's side. And there's been a reluctance to talk about, pray about, speak about this whole notion of forgiveness. And so if you have unforgiveness in your heart, you're not on God's side. And it's not like you stand before God and say, well, at least I wasn't a racist. And he says, well, but you have unforgiveness in your heart. Some of the harshest rebukes in Scripture are around unforgiveness. They're around unforgivenness. And I've had some folks as I kind of shared this perspective say, well, it's a bit too soon. I mean, it's too soon to have this conversation about that. But I thought back to Christ. Here's Christ on the cross, blood draining down his face, crown of thorns, all of this, been beaten, bruised, everything. He's on the cross. Every breath was difficult. Every breath, I'm thinking he's saying, I can't breathe. Every breath is difficult. And as he pulls himself up, he says to the thief on the cross, not the wrongly accused thief on the cross, the thief on the cross, right? You'll be with me in paradise. As he pulls himself up, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Was it too soon? I mean, the reality is that if we are going to solve for the right thing, and I'll get to that in a second, there has to be justice, absolutely, and we have to be focused on that. But there also has to be mercy. Also has to be mercy. And the third thing that God downloaded to me is this notion of righteousness. and the fact that we should be trying to be righteous people. Now, what is righteousness? I mean, in a human sense, a lot of times we talk about righteousness in terms of being like morally right. I did something that was morally right. But when you think about righteousness from the perspective of God, it's more than that. It really is this notion of making sure that you're on the right side in God's eyes, that you've aligned how you view issues and how you're responding to issues to the way that God would have us respond. In other words, it focuses on your character, your conscience, and your conduct. So we need people to be righteous, and not just some people, one group of people, but all people need to be righteous and need to be focused on being righteous. You know, I live in the near Baltimore, and a couple of years ago, there was a story in the press that got a lot of attention, and it's a perspective that's still out there today, that when police officers would come into, you know, certain communities, a crime would have been committed, someone would have called, and the police get there and no one's going to tell them anything. And this whole thing came under the banner of no snitching, no snitching, no snitching. And, you know, when I unpacked that, I thought to myself, I said, you know, when you think about what that actually means, it means that I'm willing to allow injustice in my community if the alternative is to turn in somebody who's part of my tribe or my community. So I can live with injustice. I will live with injustice if the alternative is to turn in someone who's in my tribe or in my community. And I thought about, you know, these police officers that were there with George Floyd and some other situations. You know, they see something that's happening, and they go back to the precinct and they kind of get their stories together, and you hear about these things that happen. And if you think about what the perspective is, well, I'm willing to live with injustice if the alternative is, right, to expose somebody who's part of my tribe. It's the same thing. The police have a no snitching mentality, and as the same way in the community. And what God put on my heart was this notion that in all those cases, that's not righteous. You can't have injustice in any community, any setting, in the boardroom, in the classroom, in the neighborhood, in the precinct, in the family. Not if you're a person who's on God's side, because if you're a person who's on God's side, you're a person who is seeking to be righteous, which means aligning your conduct, your character, and your conscience with God. And so that's a call not just to white people, but it's a call to black people, it's a call to all people. And so we can't have a narrative that says that, look, we want to focus on, you know, the culpability of white people and not the responsibility of black people. Or one that says we want to focus on the culpability of black people and not the responsibility of white people. See, because when Christ came, he said, no, you need to focus on the culpability of all people and the responsibility of all people. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that we're all challenged to be righteous people who seek righteousness in every setting and in every environment. And that's just not a narrative I've been hearing out there very much. Frankly, not even from, you know, some Christian leaders. This whole focus this way as people draw their lines. See, because I believe strongly, and I think Scripture supports, what we should be solving for is reconciliation. That's really where we're headed, because we are called to a ministry of reconciliation, first to God and then to man. And that's not what you're hearing. See, that's the reason why in the media, if a story has conflict, it's a headline story. You know, I used to work for Goldman Sachs, and I remember when I first started with Goldman, you know, I used to think, because I didn't know much about investments, that the only way that you could make money was if the market went up. And I quickly learned that they said, no, you can make money if the market's going up or if the market's going down. Doesn't matter. The place that is hard to make money is when the market is flat, because what you need is volatility. So we talk about buying and selling volatility, that perspective, right? Volatility. Well, the media works exactly the same way, right? That's why the media says if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, if there's volatility, we're going to focus on that story. But reconciliation brings stability. So when you see people coming together in the way that I'm talking about, there's not volatility in that story, so it doesn't get there. So if you're getting how you think about this issue from those sources, you shouldn't frame it that way, because these are sources that are designed to keep us. So critically important is the biggest racist that's ever existed is Satan. He hates the human race. He wants nothing but conflict between us. He wants hatred. He doesn't want reconciliation. And so that's why I believe so strongly as Christians, we have the answer to this dilemma, focusing on God's side and focusing on making ourselves be on God's side. And so in order for you to have this reconciliation, we have to be willing and able to listen to each other's stories. It's not just about you hearing the pain of Black folk. I'm sorry. I mean, I know hear people say that, but that's one part of it. But we also have to be willing to listen to your story. Now, I have a friend of mine that became very close in business school, and he and I got together to get to know each other. And I realized early on that it's important for me to hear his story. And his story was that when he was a 16-year-old boy with his two younger siblings, his parents dropped him off at home and said, "We'll be back after we go to the grocery store," and never came back. And he's never seen them again. And he did the best he could to take care of his siblings until social services found them, and then they got separated and put into homes and that kind of thing. And I started to think about that. And I said, well, this is a guy that understands what it means to be rejected. This is a guy that understands what it means when someone says that you're not worthy of me, of my attention, or being involved with you. There's something about you that I don't want to be connected to. And so what I was able to do is I said, well, gosh, I can find my story in his story. So somebody throwing an egg at me, he gets that. And because I heard his story and I connected it to my story, we were able to have a reconciled relationship that built a friendship across the races. And then with that story, it's connected to the greatest story, which is God's story, the story of reconciliation of all men, regardless of race and creed. And so from my standpoint, this is the way, in my view, that that we need to be thinking about this issue. And I love what Dr. Tony Evans says, from the womb to the tomb, in terms of thinking about race issues. So if you're someone who cares about, Black folks when they're in the womb and they're facing abortion, that's a good thing. But if you don't care when there's injustice that's happening in the street, then you don't have a comprehensive from the womb to the tomb perspective. And in the same way, frankly, if you're someone who just cares about Black folk, when there's a police officer with his knee on his throat, a Black man looks like myself and a knee on his throat and says, "I can't breathe. I only care then, but I don't care about what happens in the womb," then you don't have a womb to a tomb perspective. See, Jesus went from the womb to the tomb. He understands that perspective. And because he went from the womb to the tomb, just as we all do, that's how we have to frame these issues. If you think about them comprehensively in that way. And we can't allow ourselves to get locked into the perspective and a perspective that's built by the culture, not if we're going to be on God's side. And I want to make one other point too, as I sort of close up here. One of the big debates also in the public square in terms of picking sides is it systemic racism or is it not systemic racism? And that whole the question that goes back and forth, and you hear that, and folk are arguing about that. And the insight God gave me was to go back to Scripture. You see, when Jesus came into the world and came into the Roman world, there were systemic issues. You remember Simon the Zealot? Well, Simon the Zealot was zealot about overturning the Roman government. He was the guy walking around with the placard that said "Jewish lives matter." And he probably came to Jesus because he thought, well, if this guy's the Messiah, he's going to come and deal with these systemic issues. And so Jesus comes and he's got this toolbox of ways he can deal with getting to what he's solving for, which is reconciliation of all men to God and to man. And he has all these different perspectives, and he could come in and focus on the systemic issue primarily, the Roman government, and come in the way that the people thought he was, to come in as a king like David and with the sword. But what did Jesus do? He focused on the individual heart. He focused on the individual heart. He spoke to the systemic issues, challenged the systemic issues and perspectives with the Pharisees and with the Jewish government. But he never allowed himself to get pulled away from where the real transformation happens, which is individual hearts. And so he talked to the woman at the well. He spoke to Nicodemus in the still of the night. And when they brought him that coin and said, should we pay taxes? Instead of getting caught up in that perspective, he said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, unto God what is God's. Because he understood that if you have unjust laws, but you have just people, they'll change them. But if you have just laws and unjust people, unrighteous people, they won't even enforce the laws that you have. And that gave me an insight, because the things that we've seen in the streets, and when a police officer or someone else is acting in a certain way, I mean, these things are already illegal. The issue is not an issue of systemic, it's an issue of the heart. And so Jesus knew, which is clear, that if I change the hearts of people, that they'll make unjust laws just. If I change the hearts of people, they'll enforce just laws. And they'll have that perspective of not just no justice, no peace, but they'll understand no mercy, no peace. In other words, they'll be seeking forgiveness and making sure that there's a culture of forgiveness when wrongs do happen, if you're on God's side. And so from my perspective, that's the comprehensive view. If you're going to care about Black folks, I got it. I love it. But you got to care about it comprehensively. And you got to be caring about the breakdown in the Black family. I mean, the best thing that can happen is really helping us build strong, godly families. You have to care about all of those things. And it goes beyond slogans and things of that nature, and it goes to really working with individuals one-on-one and helping change the heart, of look for opportunities to do what Jesus did. I'm not saying you don't speak to systemic issues and that they aren't there. They are. But the reality is that the way that those things get changed is by individuals who are committed to a concept of reconciliation between all men, both first to God and then to each other, that actually makes the transformation that lasts. And that's the kind of transformation that we are called as Christians to do. So I end where I started. Are you on God's side as you think about this question? Are you on God's side? Amen? Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you very much for that message. Roland, Dave is going to be compiling questions that have been coming in. One for you is, it's also just struck me how God has prepared you for this in your journey. The fact that as president of the National Fatherhood Initiative, what he showed you and what you focused on, and now in caring that, what are some of the lessons you learned from your role in the National Fatherhood Initiative that kind of impact how you see what's happening and what's happening in Black communities around America and some of the problem?
Well, I think probably the biggest thing for me, and just a little background, I grew up in a father-absent home. My mother, left my dad when I was 6, 7 years old, 4 kids under the age of 8. We moved in a tougher part of town. And so I've lived that life. I understand how difficult that is, both for mothers and for children. And I think in terms of this context, for me, I have to look at like comprehensively how we're getting here. A lot of the focus will be on the what happened, but when you start looking at the backgrounds of some of the folks that are sort of involved and end up in situations where you're having an interaction with police, there are factors that are there that we can focus on. And I went back and I looked at George Floyd's life and how horrible, what happened to him was. But when I folded back, the reality is just not in terms of like how he was killed, but in terms of like what put him in a circumstance for that it's all the stuff that I was talking about when I was at National Fatherhood Initiative. In a father-absent home, data shows that you're more likely involved in drugs, more likely involved in crime, more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to produce another father-absent home. And he had all of those attributes. So for me, tearing down statues and everything, I get all that. But the reality is, what I really would need you to do, rather spend all your time trying to tear down statues of dead men, what I need you to do is help build strong families of living men, and helping men step into the life to be involved, responsible, and committed fathers. One of his kids didn't even know what he looked like. His mother had to say, "That's your father that they're talking about." So to me, again, I want to make sure, and that's why for me, when I think about this in terms of systemic issues versus the individual heart, we need to lean more into focusing on the individual heart. There's a family that my wife and I are helping. This woman is, she's got 6 kids, 10 and under, and she's pregnant with her 7th. And, it's a very difficult situation. The father is not engaged the way that he needs to be. And she's in need. She's in need. And so for me, I'm like, well, if Black Lives Matter, then This is how you can transform. So there's a couple of folks in my neighborhood that have the Black Lives Matter thing. I'm gonna go up to their door and I'm gonna knock. So you say Black Lives Matter, here's some lives that matter. Will you help? Will you help us find care for her? Will you help support us? Will you go outside of your comfort zone? And that's the challenge to folks who say Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. It doesn't really matter to me from that perspective, because ultimately it's about transforming the individual heart. And so the work at National Fatherhood Initiative really showed me how by just transforming and building strong families, that we can bring this reconciliation, and each one of us has an opportunity to reach out and find someone. It's like look down and around to get at that. And I think a lot of times if you focus just on the systemic part, you can end up like Don Quixote, trying to fight windmills. It just seems like you can't make a difference, but you can make a difference in an individual life. And that's what I encourage all of us to do. And frankly, that's what Jesus did. He spent his time with 12 guys primarily, and look what happened. And by the way, Rome ended up being accepting of Christianity, right? Constantine. I mean, why? An individual heart was changed, which then changed the systemic issues so that Christians were no longer discriminated against. You see? And so I really am very focused on, on that, and the fact that I know Satan wants us to be divided, disconnected, hating each other, going to our own tribe, supporting our own tribe. That has been his plan from the very beginnings. First, separating Adam and Eve, and then separating all the rest of us. And I just want to encourage you that we have to, the call is reconciliation. And I don't care if you're white or black or whatever. If you don't have a heart for reconciliation, then you're not on God's side. And that's not me saying it. It's the scripture saying it, because our God is a God of reconciliation.
Turn it over, Dave. Have you got some questions that have come in?
Absolutely. The first question I'm actually bright enough to take. If I could take the liberty, someone asked, because I want to quote you, what's your Roland's last name? And it's Warren, W-A-R-R-E-N. That's question one. Question two, there's a question, Roland, about identifying a specific couple of problems, and they're asking if it's systemic or individual choice, and that's the rate of abortion and the rate of those born out of wedlock in the Black community. They're asking of those things if they're systemic or individual.
Well, I mean, it's both. I mean, it's both. I mean, certainly there's an individual choice that you make to have sex outside of wedlock that puts you in a situation where you're at risk for abortion. And again, it's a situation I know well. I got my girlfriend pregnant in college. We were encouraged to abort. We didn't, by the grace of God. That was an individual act. But there is a systemic part of it in the sense that in the sense that we have a culture that encourages that and supports that, and has framed that for Black folks and really all folks as empowerment. See, to me, when you think about that issue, I mean, in order to abort a child, this is what you have to believe. And this is why I reject it so vigorously for my people and specifically, but I think for all people. What you have to believe is that child coming into the world is going to be a net negative. There's nothing good that can come from that child. So imagine a woman's about to have an abortion, and right before they're ready to do the procedure, doctor comes in and says, we've got some news. This child that you're about to abort is going to be the richest person in the world. We got the news. Well, do you think she's going to go through with that abortion? I'll let you do the thought experiment. Probably not. Her current circumstance did not change. What happened? What changed? How she started to view the child, the value of the child. So what you have to believe is that Black children on average are a net negative. That's a systemic thing. So we have a system that basically is saying that Black children on average are net negatives. So we're better off than having less of them in the world, which is frankly the way that Margaret Sanger, who started Planned Parenthood, actually thought about Black people. So you've got both of those things at play. An individual act that puts you in a situation where you're facing this difficult dilemma, but the systemic approach to remove and having less of them is better. You follow what I'm saying? So you know, a lot of these things there, that's why for me, you know, these either or kinds of, is it this or is it that, or, you know, to me, a lot of the times it's actually both. But then the question becomes, well, then how do you change these things? And that's why I say, well, your framework is on the individual heart. You know, you look at Dr. King, what did he do? There were systemic issues in the culture. And yes, there was an approach for legislation, but mostly what he did was he engaged individuals to walk those streets, to take that injustice so it could be viewed by others and change individual hearts. Do you see what I'm saying? So if we focus too much on, well, this is systemic, whatever, then, and we don't do the individual piece, it'll remain that way. People will get frustrated, angry, riot, things of that nature. And I think we have the power and the model from the biblical narrative of how we need to respond to those things. Sorry for the long answer to the short question. It's my gift. Or maybe curse.
Good stuff. Good stuff. We have another question. You know, essentially you talked about, you know, Joshua's question, are you on our side or our enemy? And the response was no. And they introduced a third side, and that's the Lord's side. This other question now is, so given that, what is the do? What would the Lord have us do? What's the action plan therefore?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, from my vantage point, that, you know, we have to be praying for reconciliation in our culture. And I think a lot of that comes from the individual acts that each one of us is willing to do. I mean, are you reaching out to folk who don't look like you proactively? Or are you just staying in your own tribe? And by the way, that question is not just to you as a white person, you know, but if that's who asked it, but it's to me as a black person. I mean, this is a two-way street. You know, it can't just be about hearing the pain of black people in our story, but we got to hear your stories too. Because when we hear each other's stories, then we can understand each other's needs, and then we can do that. So I think from a practical standpoint, you know, if you believe these things that are being communicated, look for opportunities where you can personally get involved, personally engage. And frankly, I candidly support organizations that are really focused on reconciliation and not conflict. I mean, I think you really need to, you know, do that. And again, I understand there's a time for, you know, the conflict. I get that in terms of, you know, what needs to happen sometimes. But, you know, I just don't think that we're leaning into this notion of reconciling. Justice does not bring peace in and of itself. You have to have mercy as part of that, and then also forgiveness. And so, you know, and I think the other thing too, I love people who say, well, this is the time for us to lament and reflect. We need to do that. And I would just say, you know, seek God's guidance on how you personally, individually can change some lives that can bridge that divide between the races. I mean, that's what happened with me. You know, I started hearing other people's stories, white people's stories and other people's stories. And I said, my gosh, I can find my story in their story. And that created an opportunity for us to build a relationship. And then you start helping people, you know, and one of the things Dr. Evans says, what Dr. Tony Evans says, which I love, he says, you know, when you start to reconcile, now go help someone who's who's more disadvantaged than yourself. And I think it's a perfect way to do it, because we start serving together, serving others together. Then that creates this tremendous bond between us, because we're called to serve and to bless others. And that really helps build the relationship between the people who are doing the serving, but also it bridges that divide.
Yeah. 7.5 billion people in the world. Somebody's got it worse for me, and I got to go find them. We have got an interesting question here, and it kind of summarizes several of the questions. We're getting a bunch, so the guys are percolating, and this is great. And this one says, how do we back up? How do white hearts change, and how do black hearts change?
Well, who's the changer of hearts? I mean, really. I mean, to me, God, of course. Well, God, absolutely. I mean, so to me, you know, as a black person, I cannot have unforgiveness in my heart. And the narrative just can't be, see, it gets a little complicated, but if you listen to the press and the media and you frame it based on what you're hearing, basically what's supposed to happen that's going to bring us peace in this nation is that white people need to just acknowledge their privilege, and then once they acknowledge their privilege, they need to feel guilt because they've acknowledged their privilege. So now you need to have white guilt. And so you need to have that guilt. And how long should you have that guilt? Forever, because that guilt is tied back to the legacy of slavery, which is an immutable fact that will never change. So as a white person, you're supposed to feel guilty forever. Right? Now, as a black person, how am I supposed to think about these things? Well, I look back on the legacy of slavery and I'm supposed to be angry. And how long am I supposed to be angry? I'm supposed to be angry forever. You cannot reconcile guilty people and angry people. It just never happens. If there's a break in a marriage and one spouse cheats and the other finds out, one is guilty, the other is angry. You're never going to reconcile that marriage if the one person stays angry and the other person walks in their guilt forever. Even if the person who's been wronged forgives, if the other person continues to walk in guilt and shame forever, they'll never be able to reconcile. So what will bring them back together? Them refocusing on the foundation of their marriage, which is this love and this connection. That's how you get reconciliation. God is love. That connection is how you do it. So that's the narrative out there that's saying this is how we're going to be able to move forward. But we'll never move forward with guilty people and angry people. See, when I look back on the legacy of slavery, I think about it the way that Christ did when he looked out over Jerusalem. He looked out over Jerusalem and he saw two types of people, victims and victimizers. And when he wept, he wasn't just weeping for the victims. He was also weeping for the victimizers. That's why think about it, the last thing that Christ did on the cross was what? He forgave victimizer, not a victim, a victimizer, the thief on the cross. And he said, forgive them for they know not what they do. Who? The people that were crucifying us and all mankind's sins, the victimizers. So God leans in and has a heart for the victim and the victimizers. And for the victimizer, he says, be just. And for the victim, he says, you must forgive. And he modeled that by his death on the cross. So you can't reconcile guilty and angry people. So then how should we look at the legacy of slavery that brings reconciliation? Well, with sorrow. Why? Because you should have sorrow for the slaveholder, because he was so consumed and was so deceived and so consumed by sin that he couldn't see that he was enslaving someone who was created in the image of God. And so God looks at that and says, sorrow that you were so blind that you could not see that you are enslaving a fellow image bearer. And when you look back at the slave, what is it? Sorrow that you were subjugated to this. So whether I'm a white person or a black person, when I look back at the legacy of slavery, I should have the perspective of sorrow. Now, sorrowful people can reconcile. And then for those sorrowful people, then you examine your heart. If you've been a victimizer, be just. If you're a victim, you must forgive. See, and part of the reason we are where we are is because, and again, this is my perspective, and folk may challenge it, but is because I really believe strongly. See, a lot of how I think about the race issue. I mean, Dr. King was just amazing in terms of how he thought about this issue, because he wasn't a civil rights leader who happened to be a Christian. He was a Christian who happened to be a civil rights leader. And so he framed this issue in the context of Christianity. If you go to his statue in Washington, D.C. or whatever, the monument, it says he was a drum major for justice. Yes, he said that, but that wasn't all he said. In fact, that wasn't even the last thing he said. And then he said, I'm a drum major for peace, and I'm a drum major for righteousness. And then he went on in that same speech and then talked about how he as a Christian should be helping a fellow man along the way. And even before he died, when he was in Memphis, and he's talking about why he came, and he says, some folks were telling me I should not come because of what some of what our sick white brothers might do to me. Now just think about that for a second. He didn't say sick white devils, sick white. He said brothers. Even for folk who wanted to kill him, he saw the brotherhood, that they were image bearers who were deceived. And so sorrowful people can reconcile. God has a word for the victim and for the victimizer. And whichever side of that spectrum you're on, God has a word for you. And as Christians, we should view things that way. So that's why I say this is an issue of the heart. God transforms hearts. He transformed the heart of Paul from being a victimizer, right, to someone who spread the gospel. You see, so that to me is the narrative, and that's how I've tried to live and tried to walk in the fullness of that in terms of relations with folks in my race and folks outside my race.
Thank you very much. For everyone who's asked questions, I have to batch them because there's quite a few, but they do fit into categories. And someone asked an interesting question the way they worded it. Roland, can you help us understand the difference or how to balance the church's responsibility to reconcile, but also the church's responsibility of prophetic ministry?
Well, I'm not sure. I know what you mean by prophetic ministry. I mean, I know what
they actually use the phrase prophetic responsibility.
Well, I don't necessarily see those things as separate things. Maybe I'm not understanding the question well. I don't know. I mean, I guess I have to say I don't know the answer to that. But I do think that the church has the lead on this notion of reconciliation, which means that pastors, whether you're in a white church or a black church, you have to, in my view, be preaching both sides of that equation. So if you're just in your church and you're only preaching to white folks and saying, talking about the justice side of this thing, but you're unwilling to say to black folks, hey, if you have unrepentance, if you have unforgiveness in your heart, you got to be willing to preach both sides of that equation, whether you're in the black church, white church, mixed church, whatever. We can't just talk about this as a one-sided issue. That piece, if you don't do that, then you're not going to get the reconciliation, because it takes justice and mercy for folk to be reconciled.
Yeah.
So you got to be willing to, and that takes courage, to be able to be willing to do that. Whether you're a black pastor or a white pastor, whatever your congregation is, because some folks are going to have a problem with that.
I just throw out there also, if you're interested in understanding this third perspective of God's perspective as opposed to the other guys or mine, I'd encourage you. There's a conference that we are able to listen to, if I can say it that way, between Jesus and the Father, and Jesus is having a personal conversation with the Father. We get to listen to it, and it's in John 17. And I'd encourage anybody who's questioning how to balance all this, ask the Lord to show you what He would have for you, and then prayerfully read John 17, and think about what that says as far as our responsibility. We have another question here. If a white person doesn't feel like a victimizer just by being white, what is their role in the justice piece of the victim-victimizer formula?
Well, and it isn't. That's a very interesting question, because if you think about kind of if you look at some of the press now, that's really how people are kind of framing this issue. And I think it's problematic, because I think people have a very difficult time feeling guilty for something that they didn't feel that they did individually. So, I think from my standpoint, it kind of goes back to the thing before. It's like, well, what you've done individually to black folks or other folks or whoever, that's something between you and God that you have to kind of come to God with. But I still think that you've got an opportunity. You're still basically solving for the same thing. I think you're still looking for opportunities that I can help be a reconciler to others, either in my personal life, my personal sphere, and things of that nature. And also, going back to what I said before, rooting out injustice. I mean, many of the folks on this call are in power positions in organizations. Are you turning a blind eye to injustice that you see in organizations? In your organization, are you excluding certain people, or not reaching out to certain people because they're different from you or have different backgrounds or colors, that kind of thing. I mean, I love what Dr. King said. I long for the day when, my kids will be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Are you looking at the content of the character of folks, or are you looking at the color of the skin of folks? I mean, to me, that's the question that you have to be asking yourself. And making sure that you're creating opportunities, and that you, like that bomb sniffing dog, is that you're rooting out injustice wherever you see that, and you're willing to speak up. That's why I make the point about the whole thing about the snitching, right? Because I think that we've had those situations where we've allowed injustice if it meant exposing somebody who's part of our tribe. I mean, that's how you end up with, the situation, sexual abuse with priests or whatever. What happened? Well, somebody knew. A bishop knew. Well, what happened? The framework was, well, I'll allow injustice if the alternative is to expose someone in my tribe. Same thing can happen in a boardroom. Same thing can happen in a corporate setting about who's getting promoted, who's not getting promoted, those kinds of things. And you see the injustice. Are you willing to step in the middle of that and say, you know what, I'm not going to allow injustice just to protect somebody in my tribe? That takes a tremendous amount of courage. And I'm not saying that's easy to do, right? But those individual decisions that people make, that's how you end up making a world that's more just.
Yeah.
You end up making a world that's more merciful. It's the individual decisions that people make, which is the change of the heart. And that's why I say, that's why Jesus, clearly, he, instead of, getting an army and rushing into Rome and whatever, he focused on individual heart. He spent his time with the woman at the well to change her heart. And then guess what? Lots of people got saved. You see what I'm saying? So I still think, regardless of how you view that, you still have the same responsibility, which is to root out injustice in your own heart, and then also in the systems that you're a part of, and that you need to be proactive about it in the same way that a bomb sniffing dog was. Because why? If the bomb sniffing dog is not proactive about rooting out the injustice that is a bomb that's going to go on a plane, then the innocent die. Innocent people are hurt. Innocent people are harmed.
Well, here's an interesting follow-up to that. My little corner of the world, and then the global world as it is, we can act, but how do we get the world, cable news, social media to engage in God's truth?
I sound like a broken record, but all of these platforms are run by people. They're run by people.
Yes.
I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of Christian Union. I've been on their board a couple of times. And if some of you are familiar with Christian Union, it's an organization that really focuses on evangelizing folks in the Ivy League and other, schools in that class, elite schools. And I think one of the powerful things about that is that I look at myself and I go like, wow, there's so many people that I went to school with at Princeton that are in power positions, that are in power positions. Michelle Obama was dated my freshman year roommate. So all these different, you start thinking all these different people in power positions. And so if you think about that, and there's that, if those conversations were happening with folks in college or various settings, and they're now in power positions implementing a certain perspective, right? So what if those people were reached for Christ? So to me, by thinking about it that way, on the individual level, you don't get demoralized. And I think that's the problem often, because if you look at these big systems, and you're like so focused on, I got to change Fox News, or I got to change MSNBC, or I got to change like those systems, that you get demoralized and you end up doing nothing. And I'm saying it's much simpler than that. If you look at it through a biblical lens, Jesus started with individuals, and don't underweight the power that you impacting an individual can have, because you don't know how God's going to use that individual in the future. Righteous people who end up doing righteous things, they didn't just happen. There were people along the way who influenced and impacted their lives, who had a righteous narrative that they helped that person see and draw out in that person. So to me, I just spend more of my time focused on, yes, I speak out against the systematic issues and change where I can. But most of my focus is on how can I engage individual hearts within my circle of influence. And I just feel like if you get enough people doing that within their circle of influence, that's how you end up changing some of these systems, these systematic issues that we see. And that's empowering for me, not demoralizing.
Well, there's a lot of good questions bouncing around here, and I'm trying to figure out how to put them together into more of a mega a single question.
Let me just ask Roland, do you have some more time with us? So 8:15, guys, is when we kind of normally would break up, but if Roland can keep going and we've got questions, we'll keep going. If you need to leave, obviously, you know how to do that on Zoom.
Good. I don't have a commute today.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Roland. So we'll keep going.
Let's see. The aborted black child cannot forgive his victimizing mother. If it takes justice and mercy for reconciliation, how does she come to know this forgiveness? What if she feels she's made the right choice in choosing to abort her child?
Well, I mean, this is probably more of a theological way of thinking about this, but so I'll answer this a different way. In order for you, if you have the belief system that somebody's calling the phone, you just have to deal with the ring, I guess. If you have the perspective that an aborted child, is with the Lord, right? So if you believe that, you can't be with the Lord and have unforgiveness in your heart. Do you see what I'm saying? So I don't know that I agree with the first part of that perspective, right? That her aborted child can never forgive her, and frankly, the core issue is really is she willing to accept God's forgiveness, even more than her accepting her own forgiveness. So I mean, I don't know. I think from my perspective, part of what we try to do, certainly the work that we try to do, is help people come to a point that they see the humanity in the child growing inside of them. But we also help people understand that, this is not an unforgivable sin. I mean, an abortion is a physical act that reflects a belief of who you are and who you believe that God is. And changing that belief of who you believe God is, that God is a God of mercy, God is a God of reconciliation, and that forgiveness is there and that's available for you. I mean, I think that's what ends up transforming people.
There's a question for you to write a book on this topic.
Well, maybe so.
What would you suggest to a white person who wants to show support for Black lives but does not want to support or legitimize the political agenda of the Black Lives Matter organization?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I wrote an article, you can find it if you want to look it up, in Washington Times about 4 years ago about the real, sort of the real agenda of the Black Lives Matter organization. And I think, unfortunately, people don't separate the fact there's a quote slogan, Black Lives Matter hashtag, and then there's an organization, Black Lives Matter. So if you want to look it up, the article, it was in the Washington Times, and just put my name in and Black Lives Matter, it'll come up. But the one I wrote, and somebody attacked me after I wrote it, so that you can read that one if you want to. But but basically the perspective is that movement really is not focused on Black men at all. In fact, if you look at what they're trying to do, it really is about deconstructing the family, and I was very frustrated that the deaths of Black men were basically being used to prop up an agenda that's really not even focused on helping Black men, because they're not focused on building strong Black families. They're focused on building basically mother run families, and there's not really a role for men in any of that. So to me, if you want to show that you are supportive, then you get involved individually. So I mentioned this young woman that my wife and I are seeking to help, and I was driving to her place a couple days ago, and I noticed somebody had in their lawn Black Lives Matter and a bunch of other stuff. They had the placard, and everything. And so on my next trip, I'm going to go up to their house. I'm going to knock on their door, and I'm going to say, I saw your Black Lives Matter sign, and I've got a situation where we need help. We need help. So to put your money, your time, your talent, and your treasure where your slogan is.
Yeah.
Right. And I really, and it's not that hard, honestly, to find individual situations where you can help. I mean, the network of pregnancy centers are perfect for that. We have a ministry actually called Making Life Disciples through CareNet, which is designed to put pregnancy care ministries in churches so that folks can transition from the pregnancy center to the church for ongoing support and discipleship, and really viewing the life issue as a discipleship issue. You really want to solve the abortion issue, it really is going to mean that you're going to have people coming alongside folks who are making these decisions for a couple different reasons. One, to provide them, life decisions need life support, but also to show them a model for God's design for marriage and family. So if you're in a situation where you can do that, then find someone individually that you can help. And I don't mean just financially, time, talent, and treasure. You build those relationships. So a woman that we're helping, my church has more white people than Black people in it, and most of the folks who've engaged here with this woman, they're white people. So her 6 kids are seeing white people loving them, bringing them food, helping them, helping their mother. That goes much further in terms of racial reconciliation and moving us forward. And there are opportunities every one of us has opportunities to do that, but it's going to require moving outside of our comfort zone.
Yeah.
So if you look for opportunities there to serve in that way, that's how it goes there. And I would also, let me just make one other point. When you go and you do that, make sure you share your story. Make sure you help them see their story in your story. We've all had feelings of rejection or feelings where I wasn't good enough, or someone want to connect with me, or people who wrongly did something. We all have those stories. That's the commonality that exists between us as the human race. And so don't come into this perspective without the notion that you're an equal partner in this. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and therefore we all have an opportunity to reconcile with other people around a framework of fallen people. And so don't come in with that perspective, I'm here to save you and this, that, and the other. Come with a perspective that, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and here's my story, here's your story, and let's find our story and Christ's story in our collective stories.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm reminded when I was in college, theologian and philosopher, author Francis Schaeffer was speaking to us, and he talked about the fact that we were created in the image of God, and the most important part about being created in the image of God is that we were created to be creative. And he went on to say that has a lot to say about the arts, but more than anything, it has to do with imposing change in the course of history. That every one of us has been empowered to make a significant impact in the course of history in whatever little corner of the world God places us in. And that phrase keeps coming to my mind as you're speaking, because a lot of these questions are how to get our minds and our hands around global issues or issues as subjective as different people's feelings and thoughts and politics and so forth. And yet what it starts with is our getting a solid grip on what God's perspective is, embracing that perspective and implementing it in the little corner of the course of history in the world that God has placed us in, what's right in front of us.
Yep. No, absolutely. And that's what Christ did. And think about this, Christ had infinite power. And he chose instead to drink from a dirty cup with a woman at the well.
Yeah.
When you start to think about it this way, and you say, well, this is a waste of time. Well, that's when you start to think about it that way, you go like, wow, he's showing us the model for how you transform and how you get folk reconciled. It starts with changing individual hearts and really leaning into that.
Yep.
Again, while speaking out against the other injustices, but he leaned into the individual heart and how transformative that will be. So I just feel like there's a missed opportunity, but I think that we just need to be aware. Folk aren't interested in reconciliation. The culture is not interested in reconciliation. I had somebody say to me recently, so don't you think that all of this is good in some sense? It's going to lead to a good place. And to me, I think it's the jury's out. I mean, if the objective of all this is just to have guilty people and angry people, I don't think this is going to lead to a good place.
Yeah. Roland, you suggested a couple of support organizations that actually do work for reconciliation. Can you suggest a few? I
didn't hear that.
You had mentioned some support organizations that actually do work for reconciliation, what you're just talking about. Can you name a few or suggest a few?
Well, I'm talking about, and I just want to be clear, I'm not talking about individual organizations that are focused on reconciliations. I'm talking about organizations that will give you an opportunity to build relationships with people who may be different from you across racial, economic, whatever perspectives, and that is how we start to build reconciliation within communities. I mean, most white people have very few, if any, black friends. Most black people have very few, if any, white friends. I mean, I'm kind of unique in that just because of my background and whatever. I got good white friends and good black friends, but most people on both sides don't know. So much of what white people hear about black people is through some lens or some superficial, interactions, maybe not deep relationships. And by the way, most black people, in terms of their interactions with white people, is the same thing. So we both need to be more proactive and looking for opportunities. And a great way to do that is to look for opportunities to serve. And that's what I mean. So when you're serving together, you're reconciled in the sense that we're doing the same thing. Do you follow what I'm saying? So it's a service mindset. So I'm just make this up. So you're at a soup kitchen and you go in there and there's a black guy that goes in there and you're both serving together someone who's less fortunate to you. Well, if you're intentional in that relationship, guess what? He will start to learn about you. You will start to learn about him. You'll build a friendship. And now when he goes back to his community and you go back to your community, you can share legitimate stories about that. You understand what I'm saying? That's what I mean. I'm not saying like support, the National Reconciliation Project or whatever. I don't even know if that exists, but I'm just making it up. But I'm talking about these individual acts of service together as Christians that build those relationships. And as you build those relationships one-on-one, that's how things change within communities. There's no doubt in my mind that if my church continues to work with this person I was telling you with, that her children will look at white people differently, because these are people who came alongside and helped and supported her and supported their mother. You see what I'm saying? That's what I'm talking about. And again, that takes you outside of your comfort zone. But I'd say pray and be proactive in terms of finding those opportunities. That's what I'm talking about.
Ron, I do have one more actually. I'm curious, have you thought about how to effectively deliver the reconciliation, the anger, forgiveness message, justice and mercy with somebody whose ears are shut to God and Jesus and the Bible? So how you deliver that message in an effective way in secular terms?
That definitely can be challenging, because everything I'm saying is really built from the perspective of, reconcile to God first and then reconciling to man. I do think that, and I've been kind of thinking about this, I do think that, on average, people want peace. And I think I think talking about this issue from that perspective also was very powerful, and really, because this, there's no justice, like people want peace. And then the question becomes, well, how do we get peace? And I think, as if I'm talking to somebody who's not a Christian, I would probably start from that perspective. This focus on, we want peace. Well, then how do you get peace? And then I built from there to then talk about justice and mercy. I mean, justice and mercy, they're in the Bible, but they are universal truths. I mean, you could look at examples of what happened in Rwanda, after, this horrible conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis, and the nation is being put back together and is moving forward, and it's not just because there was a call for justice, it's because there was also a call for mercy. That someone who, your next door neighbor, macheted your family, and there's a call for forgiveness, and those people are coming together around this whole notion. Why? Because they want peace in their nation. So I think probably if I was going to talk to someone, who's outside the faith, I'd start there with this search for peace, which people have, shalom, peace. I mean, people desire that. And actually, I'm thinking about writing a piece. People are talking about reforming the police and abolishing the police and everything. I think a name change for the police is fantastic. Instead of calling them police officers, calling them peace officers. And because that's really what you want a police officer to do. You want them to come into the community and restore the peace. How do you restore peace? It's not just by bringing justice, but it's also by bringing, mercy and forgiveness. And a good police officer operates that way, like not giving somebody what they deserve. You're speeding through a 35-mile-an-hour zone. You're taking your wife to deliver a baby. Now, if you just focus on justice, you get a ticket, we stop you, and we hold you as long as anybody else. But if you're focused on mercy, you see what I'm saying? So I think probably my perspective on that would probably be starting with the peace argument and then building from peace, like how do we get that? Because I think most people think if we get justice, then we will have peace. That's not true. The Civil War was, quote, a just war, but we're still dealing with issues related to that. The unforgiveness of the South to the North, the unforgiveness of the North to the South. And all of that stuff is still, justice didn't bring peace. It's forgiveness that has to be a part of that, mercy, which brings reconciliation, and which you see in Christ. He brought justice and mercy. Why? He's the Prince of Peace. So I probably would start there as a framework, which I think is a common ground and common perspective that people, whether you're secular or Christian or whatever, can understand, because I think we all long for peace.